We will go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome. My name is Atreus Good. I am President and CEO of Mentor North Carolina, a local affiliate of Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And you have joined us for our North Carolina Collaborative Mentoring webinar series. And our topic today is K-12 education and COVID-19. Where do we go from here? We have esteemed guests that have joined us today, which I will introduce in just a second. We want you to participate in today's webinar. As a reminder, everyone will be muted, so please use the chat box for comments, aha moments, etc., and make sure you're typing to all panelists and attendees. In a week following the webinar, you will receive instructions on how to access the recording and slides. So before we get started, share your name and organization in the chat box. I'd like to take a moment to pause. As we get started today, I want to acknowledge the recent upheaval and outrage in communities across the country regarding the results of the Breonna Taylor trial. And I think when I think about this, a famous quote by Malcolm X still rings true for more than half a century later. The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman. No matter how folks may feel about the outcome of the trial, I like to say that Black women and girls deserve much better than this. So let's take a moment to pause. Thank you. As mentioned, we are here for a conversation called K-12 education and COVID-19. Where do we go from here? The US education system was ill-equipped to respond to the extended shutdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. While administrators, teachers, and parents have worked to adapt to the new educational landscape, research shows that these efforts will not likely produce the quality of education normally delivered in person. And new evidence suggests that school closures and virtual learning caused by COVID-19 will accelerate the current achievement gaps between white students and Black and brown students. The long-term effects will not only lead to more students dropping out, but will also have a negative impact on the US economy in general. What can be done to address a hurt that could last a lifetime? Today's discussion will feature educational and youth development experts that will share best practices and challenges regarding how to rethink schools and equity during COVID-19, with a key focus on supporting the needs of marginalized students. And so today you'll hear from Keith Sutton, Chair of the Wake County Public Schools Board of Education. We have J.B. Buxton, President of Durham Technical Community College and a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education. LaTanya Patillo, the Teacher Advisor for the Office of Governor Ward Cooper. And Jose Cisneros, Somos Carolina Program Manager of Latinx Ed. Welcome to my guests today, and let us get started. And so if you could just start with introducing yourself and the work that you're currently doing and how it connects to this current moment in time.
So I'll begin. I am LaTanya Patillo, Teacher Advisor to Governor Cooper. Thank you for allowing me to join you today. I am part of a policy team in the governor's office. My primary purview is to be the voice of the educator and the practitioner in the governor's office. And so it is to inform our educational stakeholders of the governor's priorities, but importantly, to connect the stakeholder of feedback and information to inform the governor's priorities. So my goal is to, my role is twofold, is really to be the voice of the educator, but also to share that critical information that helps the governor's office make the critical decisions.
Good morning, Keith Sutton, again, Chair of the Wake County Board of Education. I, as Chair, lead the 9-member board that sets policy along with the superintendent of the district, setting policy for the school system. Been on the board now for 11 years. Wake County's the largest school system in North Carolina, 16th largest in the country. And relative to the conversation today, obviously we are wading through many of the decisions in terms of figuring out not only how to deal with and move forward with COVID-19, but particularly reopening of schools, and again, ensuring that all students, faculty, staff, and the community are safe as we move forward in doing so.
My name's JB Buxton. I'm appreciative of the invite to join this panel, and folks I've had the great pleasure of working with in the past. I serve as the president of Durham Technical Community College, which serves residents of Durham and Orange counties in North Carolina. Comprehensive community college, about 19,000 students come through here, from high school students up through working adults. Also, just finished up a stint as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education as an at-large member, and previously have served in the office where Dr. Patillo works. I was the governor's education advisor back in the early 2000s, and also the Department of Public Instruction as the deputy state superintendent after that. Thanks again, Altair, for the invite.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Cisneros. I'm the Somos Carolina program manager. Somos Carolina is a leadership and identity development program for Latinx students in Orange County and Lee County. Basically, our work revolves around supporting students in an environment that's culturally sustaining, culturally relevant, to empower them and create a community that helps them flourish and create a support network for them to become scholars and leaders. So thank you for that opportunity to join.
Great. So we will dive right in with questions. And as we're going through, a reminder to participants, you can feel free to drop questions into the chat box and we will address them as they come up. So we've been suddenly given an opportunity to create a curriculum that not only provides space and choice for differentiation, but also to expand access. And so I'm curious as to you all's thoughts about how we might use equity as a lens as we rethink schools, particularly in this moment.
I'd love to jump in here if I could, because this is a particular priority in this moment for Durham Tech. And I just want to make a few comments about that, but I think it relates to our public school conversation. For us, we've just recently released a plan that is our equity and inclusion plan that provides a series of commitments about how we're going to focus our work with an equity lens on everything we do. That includes how we develop faculty and staff, how we think about recruiting, how we think about our own policies and procedures, but most importantly for this discussion, how we think about equitable outcomes and how we recognize that given the outcomes that we have, especially with students of color at Durham Tech, we have to be really honest and hold a mirror up to ourselves about what systems we continue to keep in place that give us outcomes that nobody's happy with. And so when you look at our graduation rates or our economic mobility rates, we clearly have to walk back into our systems and classrooms and support efforts to have a change to the outcomes. And I think when we think about our public schools, it's a very similar kind of endeavor. We, as educators, I think a lot of times like to see ourselves as kind of equity champions just by virtue of the profession we're in. But for many of us, and I myself, often realize that we have allowed certain systems or processes or supports to perpetuate that continue to give us results that are not in fact equitable and in the best interest of our students and our state. So that equity lens to really understand what it's going to take to get to the outcomes we all, I think, say we believe in, and I'll give everyone the benefit that we all do believe in, to be honest about what needs to change to get those outcomes.
I think, JB's touched on a good point, and I think we're at a place now where, again, as educators, equity seemed to be something that was almost automatic in terms of our thinking and what we did or what we do. But I think the challenge for educators, especially in K-12, is how to operationalize equity and thinking about outcomes and how we begin to move towards outcomes. The days are gone now where it was good enough to have a mission statement or value statement or belief statement that says we believe all kids can learn, all kids can succeed, all students can be great. And for many of our institutions, that was simply enough to have a statement such as that in our mission statement, a belief statement, a core values or something. But our superintendent often says what gets measured is what gets done. And so now we're starting to look at instances of, again, how to operationalize equity by looking at what are we really doing and what outcomes, to JB's point, are we achieving. So when we're looking at things such as recruiting and retention, hiring, how many teachers of color do we have? Many of our, here in Wake County and across the state, the teaching force is about 84–85% white female. So what efforts are we making to ensure that we're recruiting, retaining more educators of color? We look at the number of principals. We look at disparities in terms of students, suspension rates, graduation rates, how are African-American students and other students of color faring, rates of students of color that are in our advanced placement courses, taking advanced placement exams. So there are a number of measures, and I could go on in terms of even procurement and organizations like, again, Wake County with over $1.6 billion budget. How much are we spending with minority-owned companies and that sort of thing? So there are a number of measures that we can look at across the board, and I think what hampers so many organizations like ours is how do we wrap our arms around this big elephant in the room called equity? And I think we have to really break it down, take it in small chunks, and looking at how we can operationalize each piece of it and what are the measures or indicators of how we're doing in those chunks to ensure that we are making a difference and producing better outcomes.
Yeah, I think Keith brought out some really good points about this representation piece. Not only I think with like who's in the classroom, who's leading schools, but also what are students learning, how are they learning that, and how do they see themselves represented in the curriculum. So that I think about our students that we work with, and I also think about that language access piece that I think right now, especially, it's become really important to have people, interpreters who can communicate directly with those families, because not only are they navigating that technological piece, but they also have to like become sort of trained in how to access where they can see their students' grades, where they can see their students' information, and without having the access to Spanish or whatever other languages they might speak, without having that connection and that language barrier addressed, then I think that's also some other challenges on top of, like I said, the technological piece.
So I would agree with all of our panelists' statements around representation and then using policy with as an equity lens, right? To make sure that not only are our students represented, see themselves represented, but are receiving access to opportunities, to curriculum that is representative of them. I will tell you, working with the Governor Cooper's Drive Task Force, we are looking at exactly that. Looking at diversifying the educator workforce and what it means to provide all of our students, but primarily our marginalized students with opportunities to access to gifted classes, developing or utilizing culturally responsive curriculum, and understanding culturally responsive pedagogy. What does it mean for our schools of education to prepare educators to work in our diverse communities, to provide this equitable access, these equitable courses, and all to increase outcomes for our students? So I think if we continue to expand those initiatives and think deeply about not just the mission statement, as Keith said, but think deeply about how we can create those policies to create a systemic change, I think we're headed in the direction of not just putting out a fire, but thinking about the long-term outcomes as a result of COVID.
And Latanya, I think that's a great segue into another question that I wanted to pose. And I think about this as a parent myself, and a daughter who's 8 who suddenly had to learn how to use Zoom, and just a number of things that have come up. And I'm curious as to what degree do you all feel the educational landscape will change permanently as a result of COVID-19? Because there are several things that have come up that have reminded us that we have to be agile and adapt. And so what are some of those permanent changes you see may come as a result of this?
Start, if I may, by connecting what's happening in COVID to the Leandro case and Leandro outcome. And just to give a background, 25 years ago, 5 districts sued the state under the auspices of the fact that the state was not providing students with, or all students with, an opportunity to a sound basic education. And in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that it was a constitutional obligation of the state to do that. Here we are now. Governor Cooper has established not only the Leandro Commission, but the judge commissioned Wested, an outside organization, to assess and provide recommendations as to how the state can meet the constitutional obligation to provide that access to a basic education. And so part of that process is providing a short-term, mid-range, and long-term plan for how the state is going to meet those obligations. And in June, the judge was presented with a report, a short-term plan for exactly what we could do in the near future to change the educational landscape as it relates to COVID, but over the long term. So just quickly, there are 7 domains where Wested recommended that, that the state needed to meet those obligations. They start with ensuring the classroom is staffed with a high quality teacher, ensuring that each school is led by a high quality principal, restructuring the finance system so that it provides adequate, equitable, and predictable funding to school districts, and adequate resources for our students who need those the most. Changing and revising, or at least creating an assessment and accountability system that assesses multiple measures, providing assistance with the turnaround function, providing access to high quality pre-kindergarten, and alignment of post-secondary and career expectations. So this plan is fundamentally suggesting that we change, again, the funding structure, making sure that the first part is making sure that our at-risk students receive support by revising this funding structure, okay? Removing funding caps for students with disabilities, students who are at risk, right? Currently, there are caps related to funding, right? It's not just that you don't have enough funding, right? But how you transfer those allotments, whether or not you can use this funding for another allotment. The suggestion has been that you remove, right? Increase funding for these school supports. So counselors, nurses, increase in funding for our school support personnel. The governor provided through his emergency education relief funds, $40 million for our school support personnel and $20 million to increase at-risk supports. Lifting restrictions on allotments, again, that would reach our at-risk students, our children with disabilities, and our disadvantaged student supplemental funding. So all of these things contribute to the systemic inequities, not having a funding structure that will allow us to reach our at-risk students. And the short-term plan that has been presented will eliminate that, and will move to restructure that funding. The second part of that is laying the groundwork so that we can move forward and provide supports for students to move forward. So you see this 2-part component of this short-term plan. Again, addressing the immediate needs of our students who are most at risk, but then how can we fundamentally change the structure to support our school systems and our districts moving forward.
Keith, I was gonna let you go first. You're sitting right in the middle of this in Wake County.
I mean, I think it's been interesting to see how COVID has impacted education and how will it impact long term. When this first hit in the spring, everybody was up in arms and we thought, oh, education is going to go virtual and we're going to see the education landscape change immensely. Now that we're at the end of the summer and the fall and people are tired of virtual learning and see how taxing it is, not so much. I think that K-12 is different. K-12 is based on, I think, the interaction of teacher and student, the hands-on experience, the face-to-face experience. We all know, especially at the younger grades, the developmental ages, in K-3, you learn to read, and 3 to 12, you read to learn. And so it's hard to learn how to read and just acquire that basic skill and learn that virtually. I would almost argue that if it's not impossible to do, certainly very difficult to do. And so I don't know that we'll see a whole lot change in K-12 once the dust settles. I think obviously COVID has exposed, as we all know, a number of inequities across the board, health-wise, education, financially, and everything else. And we've certainly seen some inequities and inefficiencies in education. And I think, you'll see some changes there. But I think education as we know it, how we engage in the business of teaching and learning, I don't know that we'll see a real fundamental change once the dust really settles. Because again, I think the emphasis on focus, even in these last few years, of the one-on-one relationship between teacher and student. And that's so important to particularly social emotional learning and health and that sort of thing. And so much of, I think, what we do will, at least I hope, will remain the same.
I see some of these things that Chairman Sutton just mentioned as learnings that won't necessarily change education, but may really strengthen what we see as the key pillars and key priorities. And I think LaTanya really raised the way in which the state is beginning to create a clear infrastructure on funding and policy that's going to allow some of these things to happen. And so I think that update on Leandro that she painted a picture of, I think gives you a sense of where the state is trying to set the table so that districts can then do the things they need to do to respond to different dynamics. But just a couple quick observations pivoting off of that and Keith's comments. One is on social, emotional, and health. And I just think we've had this kind of debate for a long time about how many nurses do we need, or school psychologists or counselors. And it's become really clear the role that schools should and ought to play to provide social, emotional supports, health supports in partnership with families and communities. And I think in some ways we ought to have passed by now the debate about the relative role of those non-instructional supports and the primacy of those and how we think about supporting education in order to support kids in learning. The second is on the role of the teacher, and I think that's right. But I think what we may see a change in is if our state gets serious about ubiquitous access to devices and the internet, good, reliable internet access no matter where you are, an opportunity to have a good working device, that we may begin to create supplementary opportunities for children to acquire information and knowledge and give teachers opportunities to be much more interactive in that classroom, working with small groups, and take some of the burden of that delivery of information to 25 students or whatever it might be at a time. That's not going to happen in K-3, like Keith said. I just think fundamentally we don't want kids in front of a screen 8 hours a day at those young ages. But later, high school, middle school, you can imagine where you create really engaging instructional environments where you're asking students to do a lot more of the rote work on their own time. But that then third thing I'll say, and then I'll stop filibustering the conversation here, is I think what we've learned about community supports that we already knew, but they've only intensified. And so as we've seen churches step in, or nonprofit organizations or youth serving groups to say, hey, we've got a space where people can get internet access, or we have a space where we can get adults connected and check in on them. It would be my hope that the change we would see is everyone pushing in to create those supports for students. So while we're getting to that place of ubiquitous access, or we're getting to that place where children need more social emotional supports than only a school can offer, we've got this urgency from this experience, and that we could be in it again. And that the last thing I'll say is, ain't gonna be no more snow days. I mean, we've already shown being at home doesn't mean you're not at school. So we may get to more time on task for kids in a longer school year where they don't have to necessarily be in a building all the time.
Yeah, I think JB, you brought up a really good point about in terms of the social, emotional, mental health needs of our students, because there's always been attention paid to it, but I think now it's just been so heightened, especially for Black and Brown students, because on top of navigating systems of oppression and racial bias, right, they might be in certain circumstances at home. And so not just like paying attention to it in a way that it makes it seem like we're just checking off boxes that we're doing this, but actually like becoming part of like the culture of schools where they're actually checking in with students as part of their routine activities. And it's not just something that we address whenever it is a problem, whenever it becomes a major issue. Like it should be, I think, part of, the culture that we live in. I think with our students, we try to do that as much as possible, right? Incorporating it into our own institutional culture, but also making it culturally relevant to them in a way that they connect with and that they can think more critically and reflect on.
Atreus, I'd just like to add to, when we think about education or we think about healthcare, of course, we think about these things in isolation, right? But what makes me optimistic about an opportunity here is that no longer are we looking at just education in the school building by itself. We have seen the impact of education on everything else, not by virtue of the training, but how it relates to the economy, how it relates to workforce, how it relates to health and wellness, right? And so I think we will be forced to rethink not just how we deliver the educational program, but the importance of the educational system on everything else that is occurring in the state. And so, I understand that there may be some fundamentals that may not change because there are some things that we know that we have to do to be successful. But this has forced us, to JB's point, to Keith's point, and Jose's point, that to think as a community, right, as a state, and what all of our sectors have to do to make sure that our children and our families are supported. So just thinking, again, broadly about more than just education. It is our focus, but it is not the only thing that is impacted.
Thank you for that. And Jose, you said something that I think can maybe lead us into a deeper discussion. And this is a quote that I have from a teacher that described her experience 3 weeks into the crisis. And she says, "I'm so stressed now and can't sleep because the families I support are under so much duress. I'm not just supporting my students with their challenges, I'm also supporting their families." And so my question, and Jose, you went into this, I'm curious as to what are the best ways we can take care of everyone's mental health during this time, because there are some significant implications on mental health and how COVID may raise some additional concerns.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times it kind of is like there's a lot of pressure put on teachers to check in with their students, right? And it's like teachers are already doing so much. My younger sister's a teacher. And so if we keep, I think, piling responsibilities on teachers beyond so much of like what their role is actually supposed to be, then I think we're going to keep running into these problems. I think Latanya brought up a good point. Like, this is a communal effort, right? This is a community. We have to tap into the resources that are in our community. As an organization that partners with schools and has those interactions with teachers and with students and with families, we're sort of like a bridge of that information a lot of times, and also because of the language piece that I mentioned. So we're actually thinking about piloting some form of learning pod, but also supporting students with wellness and having wellness coaches, and sort of having our space not only like obviously like support that identity formation, leadership, but also that wellness piece that is actually super crucial for their development, especially in middle school and high school, which is the age group that we work with.
I just want to build on this for a second. I'm thinking back to the early 2000s when there was a big push to rethink the size of high schools, or try to shrink high schools to a certain point where they were much more student centered. And one of the exercises that you saw a lot of high schools do across the country was they would sit their teachers down and they would take yearbooks and they would go through all the students they had lost from 9th grade to 12th grade at a certain time. And they would ask teachers how well they knew those students. And for a lot of teachers and administrators, the tough part of the exercise was realizing how little connection they had with so many of the students they had lost along the way. And then building their new approach to schools with how they make connections with students and really build relationships that are beyond the instructional relationship. And I feel like we are in that moment again. And as I've heard folks like Keith and others talk about their concern with the students they lost touch with between March and May of this year, or they're still trying to keep touch with. I heard teachers talk about students that they see on a Monday and then don't see again until the next week, and they don't know where they are and they have difficulty. This premium on figuring out ways for students to be known, feel like they're supported and trusted, that's going to go well beyond whether we're in a pandemic in the next 12 months. But really thinking about, again, some of these counselors, nurse, social work positions and how they augment it. But I think it's not something that our schools alone can do, just given the scale of our school size in so many communities. It's where the community and community institutions are going to have to partner to say, how do we help you know and take care of and build relationships with your students that make them want to be engaged instructionally as well as kind of persist through tough times. And I know we have lots of community institutions that do that, and probably many of them on this webinar with us today, and probably you all have lessons that we need to figure out a way to scale across the state. But I do think that's kind of the next challenge for us coming out of this pandemic.
So part of what I've been hearing, from educators that have been challenges, right, and that directly relates to their mental health, is their ability to be engaged in the decision making that's happening around how we reopen our schools, how we provide learning opportunities for our students. When you are talking to someone who is used to leading their classroom, right, and leading in building those relationships, right, and acting as a building leader, it is hard to now be removed from that and to not feel as if you were heard or listened to, right? So part of I think what our teachers, our educators are experiencing is this idea that here again, these decisions are being made and I'm not a part of that, right? That directly affect what I do. So that's, structural, infrastructural. And that's one area that I think that they're dealing with. But again, this point about building relationships, collaborating, being connected to your colleagues, right? Being able to walk next door if you were having a moment, to talk with your teammate, to be able to collaborate on the learning differently. It's different within a virtual environment. I think it is a real thing. And just think if we, again, to talk about having psychologists and social workers in the schools, what that could mean for supporting the mental health of our educators, not just our students, but having that as a resource for our educators. If we were to go back into schools, when we reopen schools, we've seen this idea of in-school health centers that had the staffing and the capacity to do that. And I know that may be a long way out, but this is how we can think about communities coming together having these health centers come into the schools to support not just students, but the educators, so that they know that they are valued as well.
You know, Tress, I'll say, not directly answering your question, but, you know, as I sit and listen to the comments, particularly focus around social emotional learning, about your social emotional health, really, and thinking about your previous question, you know, it's my hope that we don't see, you know, we're gonna see, as LaTanya kind of touched on, forced to make some changes, certainly see some external forces that push on us to change education. It is my hope that we as education leaders resist some of that and come together to resist some of that, because I think I'm hopeful that we won't see much change around teaching and learning and the delivery of teaching and learning. But I do think we'll see a lot of change around the way in which we support students and support teachers. As JB touched on, the churches, and, you know, LaTanya talked about health centers getting in. You know, Jose mentioned, you know, different community organizations, you know, supporting Black and Brown students. And so I think the way that we fundamentally support students and teachers, I hope will change, but the delivery of teaching and learning, I hope sort of stays the same. And I think what we'll need to sort of lock our arms and work together is that educators are at the forefront of that change, not policymakers. Not to say that policymakers don't have anything to contribute to the conversation, they do. And I think we as educators need to collaborate. And I'm hopeful that policymakers will allow educators to work together to change education in a way that is best for students and teachers and staff and community. But what we've seen over the years is policymakers leading that work instead of educators. And that's what I'm hopeful that there'll be more of a collaborative effort as we move forward. I just wanted to take a minute to say that. I know that wasn't a question.
No, that's great. Thank you. And you know, this next piece, I think, is something that, you know, we've been struggling through, and this notion that there's research that shows that children need in-person social interaction as a part of their schooling. And I think about that having an 8-year-old daughter and how she struggled through that. And I think that as long as COVID-19 remains a threat, any in-person schooling that we consider is going to require some high levels of creativity to mitigate risk. And so I'm wondering, from you all's perspectives, what does a realistic hybrid model look like for, say, in-person and virtual learning?
I'll take a stab at that, and I think you touched on, you know, an important point that we're trying to balance right now as we make the decision on when and how to come back, and it is that risk versus benefit. You know, obviously there are health risks that we are trying to weigh as we consider students and teachers coming back into the building. But there are also benefits of being in the building. And so what we're hearing from, you know, pediatricians, the Academy of Society of Pediatricians and all, about some of the developmental risks, social emotional risks that are happening to students as they're seeing higher rates of suicide, higher rates of obesity. Again, our younger students, the developmental risk, socialization risk of not being in the building. And so as we think about that hybrid model of sort of this combined, you know, virtual and face-to-face, I can certainly say, as a policymaker myself, we spend a lot of time trying to balance that risk, you know, benefit. What do we gain by being virtual, being online, and what are we losing also, or risking by also being virtual online, and again, not having that face-to-face contact, that socialization with other students. We even hear in our special needs students, you know, with the mask and that sort of thing, how important it is to see the mouths and the lips of teachers as they are articulating, to students, communicating with students, and just so much of again, the face-to-face instruction. And we've almost taken for granted how important that really is, and that building of relationships and how much that matters to a lot of our students, both those that are doing well and those that struggle. And so I'll end with just saying, that's a balance. I think that we're all trying to figure out is that risk benefit around a hybrid model, and what do we really gain and what do we really lose?
This conversation is really highly dependent on how much as a state, maybe as a nation, we're committed to ubiquitous broadband access, reliable, and devices. I mean, it's not a doable agenda if you're sitting in a home or a community where you cannot get online or have a reliable connection, or you don't have a device that allows you with the speed and processing power to do the kind of things that an educator, that a teacher may ask you to engage with. I think also it's not a doable proposition, hybrid, if we continue to have elementary school as the core school-age childcare institution. I mean, it is clear for parents that without the schools taking their children during the day, and I'm really thinking elementary, not necessarily middle and high, where I think there are different considerations, what they do in these circumstances is very difficult. And so when you put those two together, childcare is going to have to look different. And I just don't see a hybrid model where we say, I mean, in the short term, we're going to have to, but in the long term, a quality hybrid model where we say, okay, you're in school this week, but you're home next week. Because we know for some kids, home next week's fine. And they'll have someone supporting them, and they'll have good access, and they might not even be in a little learning pod or whatever. But for other kids, it's a week down, and a week where as try as they might, it's not there. So it's going to have to be community institutions that step in there to provide a place for kids to be supported, and learning can't just stop for that week. So I think in some of our denser communities where we do have a lot of community-based organizations to provide that support, you could see a hybrid model that's truly school and community coming together. That could work if we're in kind of pandemic moments, or if we have other instructional innovations. In rural communities, not that we don't have community-based, but we can have long distances between those for people to get to them. And that's where I struggle to see what a really quality hybrid opportunity looks like, unless we've got really strong access to the internet and devices and some way to have care for children who just really shouldn't be home alone and can't function educationally if they're home alone at the age of 6, 7 years old, as an example. And you throw on top, just clear, because I think we got some people in the chat who rightly pointed to this, the frailties in our model when you talk about students with disabilities and learning disabilities or physical disabilities, and then students who are English learners. I mean, we are really basically saying to them, good luck if we don't have a much stronger kind of community and school approach when we're not able to have people in school.
I think part of what we have to do to answer your question is have the opportunity to learn from these models, right? I mean, part of what's happening now is, we have COVID, we have to put these fires out, right? We have to meet immediate needs. But what we've also been hearing is that, educators and others are saying we do need some time to learn from these models, right? So where we could shift relatively quickly, there was a call to hold on a bit, hold on and stay put a bit for a while, because one, to speak to the point earlier about being able to track down your students, right? In the virtual model, educators were saying early on, we can't put our fingers on our students, and we need to be able to do that so we know what services that we can provide. The other side of it too is we need to learn what this flexibility requires, right? If there are some students in some districts and areas that are able to thrive in this environment, what does it mean? To JB's point, what are the challenges in a rural environment? We know broadband and access to devices and internet is a major thing, right? Business and industry for parents, to someone's point in the chat, for parents who have to work and who have to go long distances to work. Like all of those things, of course, will impact what the best model would look like. Difficult to figure that out quickly, right? So hopefully, while we're trying to figure out how to do it now, that in the background, there are policymakers and educators who are thinking, of course, long-term about what have we learned? What did we learn from the spring that can be applied in the fall? And what will we learn in January from what happened in the spring and this fall?
I think I don't know, the question is asking about a model, but I think a model, I don't see like one model like specifically fitting every situation. Like they've mentioned, it depends really on the circumstances of the school district, but rural, suburban, urban. And so really taking into consideration the voices of the people that are affected, I think that you have to do that in order to really understand what's going on. And not just coming in and sort of implementing a model that was taken from another place. I think taking into account those voices is essential, not only right now, I think, but as Latanya said, like when you consider change and what's going to happen in the future, it can't be a drastic shift back to normality because it's not realistic and it's not going to happen. And there will be a lot of negative consequences. So thinking about an incremental sort of model of how to approach the future and taking into consideration, like I said, those voices of the people being affected and the unique circumstances that they might find themselves in.
I do want to add one quick thing here, Andreas, if I could, because I'm feeling guilty of being one of those people who predicts rain, but ain't trying to build an ark. Here's one thing I do see as possible. I think the high school all of a sudden gets pretty interesting. Because if now there's an opportunity for you to do some coursework in the morning at home and then go off to an apprenticeship or an internship or a community project with other students, you all of a sudden create time in the day to make this stuff happen, and you don't create transportation challenges to get to school and then maybe do an apprenticeship or a job. And I especially think about the opportunity that hybrid presents for a student who may know exactly where she's going or he's going and begins to take courses at a place like Durham Tech or begins to do work in a pre-apprenticeship or an internship. And when we think about the barriers to students whose parents don't connect them to job opportunities in the summer or job opportunities, and sometimes are shut out of those networks, to all of a sudden we open up those possibilities. You open this whole thing with equity. I think we can layer an equity lens or use an equity lens to think about the kind of opportunities we want students to have. And the hybrid model begins to create that rather than, I'm sorry, you just got to sit in these 5 classes every day for 4 years of high school. And then you can go start walking down a career path or an area of interest. We might be able to do that a lot earlier by creating more space in the schedule and more connections.
Well, and I think, that's exactly what, I was speaking of when I talked about some of the inefficiencies that we see, in K-12 and how we deliver teaching and learning. One of the examples that I often think about, in Wake County, we're blessed and fortunate to be able to, offer courses such as German and Mandarin Chinese in most of our high schools. That's not the case in many of our rural communities. You're good if you get Spanish, and if you got Spanish and French, you're hitting on all cylinders. But there's no reason why a student in Halifax County or Northampton County or Robeson County some of our more distressed rural counties across the state, they don't have the opportunity to have German or Mandarin Chinese. You don't have the demand from the students. And if you had a few students, it probably doesn't make sense for that principal to assign the allotments for a teacher for the number of students that you have, which is going to be few. But there's no reason why a student in Halifax or Northampton or Robeson County couldn't jump on a virtual classroom and learn from the teacher who's teaching Mandarin Chinese or German here in Raleigh or here in Durham or in Chapel Hill. And so just like we use, distance learning and virtual learning and in community college and college and university system, I think COVID will make us rethink a little bit again on those pieces around delivery, and that we ought to be able to have the same course offerings that you have here in a Wake County, in a Charlotte Meck, in Durham, in Guilford, and allow opportunities and access for students in more rural parts of our state. So.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, then we'll get to calls to action. So several of the organizations on this call are out of school time or youth development programs, mentoring programs. And so if you think about that environment, we talked earlier about this notion of the community, that it's not just up to schools, but you have several organizations that support that, be that mentoring, hands-on learning, creative enrichment. What role do you think those organizations can play right now in our collective response to the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think about our work with our students. I think about the parents that we work with. We work mostly in rural counties, Lee County, Orange County. I think it's just finding creative ways and strategizing ways to continue to build those partnerships. So with churches, I think in Lee County, that's a big one because it's a really rural area, but churches, I think people are still connected to those parts of their community. So strategizing ways to, like I said, we're thinking about piloting sort of like a learning pod that supports students, not only with the academic, but with the social emotional piece. And also if there's not a good connectivity for internet, providing that as well. And we're thinking about investing in wellness coaches. And I think just finding those needs from the community and also hearing from the community. I think that's always something we try our best to do, because when we think of something, but then we implement it and it doesn't work, it's because we didn't find that connection of what was actually the need and what was it we were implementing. So finding the voices of the people in their community and cooperating with them, of course, to create solutions and innovative programs that can support their students holistically.
What Jose said.
I would probably say two things. One, engaging student voice and how we sort of activate, engage, and really listen to student voice, particularly around issues of equity. We've begun some of that work in some of our schools, and I like to see some of that work spread to more about other schools. We've seen students more engaged and involved from issues around, the virtual learning and advocating for themselves to, talking about eliminating SROs and other things. And so how we engage that student voice. And then I think as school districts and education institutions, how we open our doors more so to the public and to these community organizations to be more open to collaboration and partnerships. I can tell you, and I'll be honest, Wake County is tough to partner with and get in the door. Anybody would tell you that that is difficult to get into a school, just do something as simple as put something in teacher mailboxes, to hand voter registration cards to students. It's difficult to do. in a system of 190 schools, and it's not easy. And I would imagine it's not just Wake County, most districts, because of trying to protect students, the fear of folks coming on campus and having access. So it's not easy, but we've seen where in instances where we have been more thoughtful and intentional about how we open our doors to partnerships and collaborations with community organizations. It has worked and it's successful, but it's not something that is easy to do or that is as intuitive, I guess, as we think it might be or should be. And so I think that's the other area that we can be more thoughtful and intentional about how we as education institutions make ourselves available to community partnerships and community organizations to help us in supporting students.
One real quick thought, since you talked about in the immediate moment, and if we assume that in the spring we're going to be in some version of what we're in now, maybe a little bit more hybrid or a little bit more in, but not fully, and we don't exactly know when this vaccine is going to be effective and widely distributed, I'd love to think that organizations that have the ability to recruit mentors or volunteers, even if they can't get together in one-on-one situations, that you might call Wake County and say, give us kids who need ongoing touch points. And teachers can't do that. They're trying to work with other kids. If someone like me was a volunteer with one of the organizations on this call and they said, we got 5 kids that we want you to check in with every week. And whether you call them or FaceTime them, whatever it is, we just want there to be some touch. And you talk to them about how they're doing and how their family's doing and how academics are going. Are there specific areas where they need help? Are they struggling? And just be a voice, get some of that student voice that Keith's talking about, but also just be that touch point. You don't have to live in the same community even because of the virtual nature of it. But we have a lot of organizations here who could probably pull a lot of people who might not be commuting right now and may have some time to do that kind of thing. It would be nice to think that as a community, state community, we might come together to be that support system for students at what we hope is a unique time in our history, but could be muscles we're starting to build if this is something that we are episodically in from time to time, given the global nature of our society.
I will concur with all of the statements that our panelists have made. I will add, though, continue to elevate the voices, not of the community members, but of your organizations, right? Because you too will need support as you continue to support teachers, families, educators, school districts. So from a state level and as a servant of the state, I would say continue to communicate your needs, right? Because as you support folks, we'll need to know what's working and figure out how we can support you as you move through this collaborative effort to do what we need to do short-term and long-term. I have to jump off, but I want to say thank you to Atreus and Mentor. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to everybody who has submitted in the chat. We appreciate you, and let's continue to work together.
Thank you, Latanya. And on that point too, we'd also like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and in such a robust conversation about some key things we can look at as we try to look at the challenges of COVID-19 and how we move forward. A couple of last points here, and then we'll transition. So any youth development organizations on the call, as mentioned, we provide free technical assistance. And so there are several organizations that are looking at ways that they can remain relevant during this time and get the support they need. This is free. So if you'd like to apply for no-cost technical assistance, you can visit the website as listed here on the slide. Next week's conversation or our next webinar is the next big thing in mentoring, social capital and youth initiated mentoring. We have Dr. Sarah Swartz, who's an assistant professor of psychology at Suffolk University, talking about how youth can expand their social capital and build off the insights that youth know more than we sometimes admit or know. And how do you create the space in which young folks can pursue building those relationships in the ways in which they think would be most effective? That webinar will be happening on Thursday, October 1st from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you'd like to contact our team for more information, you can go to our website at mentornc.org or send us a note at info@mentornc.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you for our next conversation.